So I'll be brief. My role here is to facilitate this fantastic conversation with these wonderful speakers. So what I'll do now is briefly introduce each of them by alphabetical order, and I guess each one will take about 10 to 12 minutes or so to present their work. And I'd ask that at the end, we reserve some extra time for Q&A. So we'll ask questions after every speaker has spoken. Thank you. So to start us off, we have Professor Shoshana Magnet, who is an associate professor in the Institute of Feminist and Gender Studies and the Department of Criminology at the University of Ottawa. Her books include the monograph When Biometrics Fail, Race, Gender, and the Technology of Identity, and the edited collections The New Media of Surveillance and Feminist Surveillance Studies. For the past 20 years, Cara Page, who is the curator, writer, and producer of that phenomenal performance we saw earlier today, For the past 20 years, Cara Page has fought for LGBTQ, GNC, and people of color liberation through her organizing and cultural work in the reproductive, racial, and transformative justice movements with organizers of the Audre Lorde Project, Song, Project South, the Kindred Southern Healing Justice Collective, Insight, and the Atlanta Transformative Justice Collaborative. As a Black queer feminist cultural worker, organizer, and healer, she continues to build community-led collective safety and wellness strategies to interrupt and intervene on generational trauma. Professor Rory Rolfs is currently an assistant professor of biology at San Francisco State University. Professor Rory Rolfs is broadly interested in the relationships between statistics, eugenics, and genetics, and more narrowly focused on examining statistical methods used in forensic genetic identification. Harriet A. Washington is a science writer, editor, and ethicist who has held prestigious positions such as research fellow in medical ethics at Harvard Medical School and law, and a senior research scholar at the National Center for Bioethics at Tuskegee University. She wrote Infectious Madness, The Surprising Science of How We Catch Mental Illness, and has also written widely for popular science publications such as the Nature, the American Journal of Public Health, and the New England Journal of Medicine.
Hi, thanks so much. I'm really nervous. This is a very impressive group of scholars who've all really structured my own thinking. So I think, this morning's panels and just the beautiful work that we just saw really set the stage for thinking about all of the systemic ways in which surveillance is structured. And really, I feel that all of the scholars and artists we've seen so far have laid such a broad network for understanding white supremacist, capitalist heteropatriarchy. And I'm just kind of taking a microscope in to look at one specific instance of the ways in which we see that play out with respect to biometric behavioral technologies. So I'll launch in. So I just want to redirect our attention to Marianne Paget's really beautiful work, The Unity of Mistakes in Medical Sociology, in which she was really wrestling with the ways in which errors or mistakes are not just abstract events, but lived phenomena that everyone experiences and must reckon with. And of course, that these errors and deliberate mismeasures also, structure like the pain and the difficulty we have in accessing, jobs, housing, mobility, and that these errors really have to be thought of as complex sorrows that structure our lives in ways, of course, connected deeply to our identities. So let me just kind of talk a little bit about specifically how that works with respect to surveillance and behavioral biometrics. So our current security climate continues to privilege the body as one of the most reliable forms of identification. So, despite kind of like 100 years of trying to debunk a scientific history of racism and eugenics, craniometry, anthropometry, we really see these new technologies codified in new ways. Biometric technologies and the ability to simplify the body into a series of ones and zeros or binary code remain a central feature of contemporary safety measures. So to use bell Hooks's phrase, white supremacist capitalist patriarchy, of course that's central to any understanding of surveillance, or as Dr. Brown puts it in her beautiful book, Dark Matters, the consequence of racializing and gendering surveillance is often discriminatory and violent treatment. And of course we've had lots of careful case studies of how exactly that discriminatory and violent treatment occurs. So although we're seeing facial recognition continues to get, and deservedly, a lot of attention, especially as it's been codified so broadly into our passports and now into our iPhones with forms of Face ID, biometric identification is not limited to the face. And I've wanted to think really carefully beyond just the ways in which the body is codified, retinal and iris scanning, and fingerprint identification, to the ways in which biometrics is now, as the prison industrial complex continues to expand and we continue to need new technologies that make money for corporations, like the Corrections Corporation of America and other related corporations in Canada and elsewhere, we have a broadening of biometric technologies into behavioral biometrics. So behavioral biometrics are defined as when, it's pretty straightforward, measurable behaviors are used to recognize or verify the identity of a person, or as a set of technologies that measures behavioral patterns rather than just physical attributes. So in a way, it's really moving our bodies out into space. So no longer just kind of like recording the surface of the envelope, but really thinking about it in 3 dimensions, as I think our movements are increasingly recorded. So the behavioral biometric technologies specifically include computers that ask a series of questions and then measure whether how much you're sweating or your heart rate. They include scientific studies aimed at determining identity from the specific way that you walk in the world, as well as technologies that are used to measure psychophysiological responses, like those that aim to decipher a person's emotions from layered voice analysis. That is, for example, whether a person is exhibiting signs of stress. So these are the claims that are being made for them. But of course, these technologies are coding really rigid biological and essentialist understandings of race and gender explicitly, including that scientists claim to be able to identify gender and race from people's facial expressions, that the claim is that we can reliably identify using behavioral biometrics gender from the way that a person walks, as well as racial and ethnic identity from layered voice analysis. So this is really kind of like the ways in which eugenics is just such a very gifted discourse that kind of slipping from one technology into another, especially given our ongoing intensifying climate of white supremacist capitalist patriarchy. So just to give you 2 very brief examples from the scientific studies that exist, there's hundreds of these studies. In Idris's study, they claim to be able to reliably identify whether somebody was female or male from the way that they walked. Like patently ridiculous. And then this deeply troubling and really hearkening back, I think, to the performance that we just saw in Jack and his collaborators, they claim to be able to separate everybody into here the deeply troubling and horrific racial categories that they use are Western and Eastern. And then this sentence is taken directly from their study. So it's supposed to be based on how you move your eyes around the room. So like eye tracking, that eye tracking data shows different attention regions for Western and Eastern subjects viewing same race and other race faces. So it's really, eugenics are really built right into the scanner from the outset. But the kind of double mindfuck of these technologies is that despite the troubling understandings of race and gender as biological, which are coded into them, then they're really brilliantly marketed as race and gender neutral, because unlike being racially profiled or racially gender profiled by a scanner, by a person, it's happening from a scanner. So I think that that's been the real genius that has facilitated their expansion. Is that so simultaneously, while we know that they're coding reified and biological understandings of gender into the scanner, TSA still makes claims that because their behavioral biometrics program is reliant on human behavior, not attributes, it isn't vulnerable to racial profiling. But of course, scientists who explicitly claim to be able to identify gender and race identities are calling these assertions into question. That's just mild Canadian language. It's really not strong enough. So for example, one study suggested that a possible question that could prompt the measuring of behavioral biometrics would be to ask for a traveler's response to the words Islamic jihad written in Arabic. So this really is just nothing more than the biometric codification of Islamophobia. So as Peter Addy argues, behavior detection relies upon a complicated blending of a biological body and a social one. So as we see the ways in which these technologies codify identities, despite the, basically just all the decades of feminist research and scientific research that clearly shows that these categories are meaningless. That they have, like obvious course racism has meaning, but that race as a scientific category has no scientific meaning. So again, to think about the ways in which these do real damage to the fabric and of vulnerable human lives, biometric behavioral technologies are causing trauma through, of course, failure to identify race, so the ways in which continually marginalized groups of people are failed to be recognized by the scanner. And then I talk about this in much greater detail in my larger project, but I don't want to go outside my 10 minutes. The failure to even consider gender nonconforming people or gender queer people or people who don't fit the gender binary, or honestly even just non-trans women with short haircuts, or they're even kind of like, I feel that many subjects who just were on Project Runway often fail these scanners if they have any kind of fashion that is not understood as fully normative. So the failure to consider the complexities of racialized identities, mixed race identities, the ways in which racial categories do not operate in the eugenics ways that are being claimed for them, and the ways in which we're often seeing these technologies function is as a barrier to access to housing and employment, especially through the biometric behavioral codification of the US SPOT program, which the US SPOT program looked at, was like a racial profiling program that pulled people aside in lines depending on how they acted and how they were addressed, really based on kind of white supremacist criteria. And that program was then codified into instead of just using people, using scanners. And the ways in which people were pulled aside by the scanners, it's really unclear how that's been used as part of, like as a broadening net of social services, the way in which that information has been traveling. So I'm almost done. I think I'm right on time. Identifying particular forms of behavior as high risk in ways that disproportionately target the intersection of our communities, of women, of people of color, of queer folks, reveals the ways that surveillance practices remain tied up with capitalist forms of white supremacy, because these technologies are, of course, making big money for companies, including the Israeli company, WeSeeU, and I think it's no accident that a lot of these technologies got their start in criminalizing and surveilling Palestinian bodies under the settler colonial regime of Israel, or the iMotion company, which again, that's part of the kind of academic industrial complex in terms of, that's a company really dedicated to expanding the use of biometrics in research for academics. That's where it's marketed. So in these gendered and racialized surveillance technologies, vulnerable bodies are just kind of being served up as the fodder, the fuel for corporations who are interested in scrutinizing our marginalized communities in ways that are bolstering the state's twin goals of policing and corporate profitability. So in this way, biometric behavioral technologies are part of a long line of technological projects that I think was so brilliantly captured in the last piece, aimed at separating, surveilling, and then criminalizing marginalized communities. So of course, I'm arguing for abolition now, and so abolition also thinking about the ways in which we might interrupt the expansion of these technologies that are only furthering the aims of racist and sexist regimes, and what it might look like to work towards Dean Spade's more comprehensive and equitable outcomes for social problems rather than technological magic bullets. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. So I just want to say it's an honor to be on this panel. I love everyone's work, and I'm just really excited. I feel like I've met my people. I've been talking about eugenics for a very long time, as many of my friends and family know. See, other people are talking about it as well. It's not just me. I just want to speak specifically to the medical industrial complex. I've been a transformative justice anti-violence organizer for over, 20 some odd years, or maybe just out of the womb, whatever, let's take it there. And I think I'm committed to no longer being in anti-violence spaces that don't speak to the critical ways the medical industrial complex contributes, extends, permeates throughout with such a strong white supremacist belief that all bodies that are not white, Christian, male, able-bodied, cisgendered, U.S. citizens are expendable and are not healthy nor fit. And that the public health system is very much based or steeped in the ideology that many of us are less than human, especially as Black people and as Indigenous people. So why then are we only speaking to violence in the prison industrial complex, or even speaking to anti-police work and not really talking about, I'm not talking about all hospitals or all, actually, let me be clear, I'm not talking about anti-science. I'm talking about the roles that have, the ways that our communities, our community healers, our communal infrastructure of wellness have been relegated to something negative, something witchery, something wrong, and instead of being seen as powerful ways we have recreated ourselves and carried traditions, healing traditions that honor our ancestral legacies of survival and resilience. And so if we're not thinking about medicine in those ways, and we're not politicizing the role of medicine and healing in those ways, then we're always dependent on a state ideology of what health is and who is healthy, which isn't me, right? And most of us in this room, right? So then I just have to keep asking the question then what is our responsibility as scholars, as bioethicists, as public health lawyers, as organizers to really push the paradigm on what we mean by healing, healthy, and wellness? And how will we redefine it and reimagine what we make that for ourselves? I'm so not looking at my notes. Historically, the role of medicine, indigenous to all cultures and communities, has been dispossessed from our healers and from our communities. The criminalization, for example, the criminalization of Black and indigenous birth workers, particular to the US South, which was much of the piece that you just saw here today with the ensemble, really speaking to an absolute dismissal and erasure of Black birth workers and midwives and criminalizing them in the early 30s by one moving in, using the Shepard-Towner Act to delegitimize by actually using certification, saying, well, if you can't read and write and you're not certified, then you can't birth babies, and really pulling off then all these birth workers that had been carrying the next generation of communities, particular to the US South, and clearly had been holding babies, birthing babies for years, and training others, and then was criminalized for doing that after conveniently training white male doctors who came from the North to the South through the new public health system that was evolving out of a very eugenic lens, and said, teach us how to birth babies, and then turned around and said, okay, great, you're not the ones anymore. We will dismiss you, we will erase you, you no longer exist. What is that? So what is our responsibility, one, to even understand the role of birth work? And again, this is even in very binary terms. There's another project I was working on, pre-medical industrial complex timeline work, looking for birth workers, indigenous, Latina, African American, of different, all ethnicities, and different in the trans community, gender nonconforming community, and talking a lot about like that erasure of two-spirit birth workers in particular that does not get told, and the increased Christianity and Christian supremacy that came down in the US South completely erased a history and a knowledge and a passing on of birth work as traditional to survival and liberation. So what I always like to say is actually birth workers or organizers are the first revolutionaries because they are the reason we exist. So why are we not honoring that as not only a tradition, but a revolutionary rites of passage? So watching the decimation of community-led health like birth working in the US in particular, especially Black and indigenous, has been indicative of state violence controlling profit over people for the sake of medical achievements, medical industry, and the science industry. And again, I say I'm not anti-science, I'm just anti-scientific racism. I'm anti-using our bodies for profit, and certainly never for the value, the worth, the well-being, and existence of my people and our peoples. As trans, as queer, as Black, as brown, as indigenous, as migrant, it was never about our survival and our wellness. But also having our medicine stolen from us. And in particular now looking at a disaster-based economy, the implicit ways communities are blamed for our natural disasters, especially because as seen as women of color, as people of color, as queer and trans folks of color, that we are binding the systems, we are depending on state systems, so therefore it is our fault that natural disasters are happening because God is coming down on us. This is a political problem that this is the belief. It is a problem that the Louisiana governor thought it was legitimate to ask for to sterilize Black and Latino women after Hurricanes Rita and Katrina. That is a problem, and I have no idea yet what's happening in Puerto Rico, right? But these are not, or the Caribbean, this is not the past, it's the present. If anyone thinks Henrietta Lacks was when eugenics or these scientific racist practices stopped, we're in trouble. So I'm asking of us, what is the charge to keep doing our work, to keep doing the research that allows us to uncover and unpack the root causes of systemic violence that justify an erasure and a medical pathologization of our communities. Where I wanna take us actually is Often the medical industrial complex is not seen as synonymous with policing and surveillance. Yet from lantern laws to body cams, the medical industry has been there upholding the myth and scientific racist beliefs that some of us are pre-genetically destined to be criminals, that some of us are pre-genetically destined to be mentally, emotionally, physically unwell, whatever the fuck that means. And of course, as you're speaking to the sort of the biometrics of what we look like, literally our bone and blood, seen as less than human. So then how do we change that as something that has been normalized, something that has been pathologized, and reinvent that and reimagine what our bodies are and how we can value our bodies and well-being? I know I need to close out. Just to name, I want to name here, much of my work has been informed by disability justice, and I do think there is still a relegation of healing and wellness that completely moves itself away from this lack of analysis around the purity of body and this idea that there really is healthy body. So if we're really going to talk about healing and medicine and wellness and transforming these ideas or constructs, how then can we move away from an ableist lens? And finally, just to take us to an abolitionist lens, I do want to see us demolish Dr. Sims' statue and any relics of him as a demigod, right? But that's not where it ends, right? Because where are we protesting the Kessel and Mumfords distributing quinacrine to private doctors all over the world to administer involuntary sterilization? Stopping clinics and doctors perpetuating false myths that trans men need to use Depo-Provera before they start tea? How are we challenging egg trafficking known to be carried out on immigrants? The barbaric practices of shackling pregnant women in prisons? This is eugenics. Or the thousands of women involuntarily tested on Depo-Provera in the 70s before FDA approval, but I wouldn't approve it now, by one doctor who's now tenured as a professor at Emory. How do we keep pushing these paradigms and making these things normal when we know we have to transform, recreate, and reimagine? And I just want to finish the psalm that you saw earlier. There were actually a lot of words to those movements, to the text, and so I just want to leave with this. We rise and rise, we release you from your cages and outrage, from your circus-themed realities of being tested on and measured by eugenic records and scientific genocide. We release you, we release you, we release you. We will reclaim our blood, our bone, our memory. This is a psalm for us. How will we release ourselves from scientific genocide? Thank you.
All right, well, I'm gonna go way over 10 minutes unless you bear with me. I'm gonna show you a lot of slides I'm not gonna discuss. But if there's anything there that you wanna talk about, raise it during the Q&A or during the larger discussion. Essentially, I wanna talk about only one aspect of the tyranny of medicine, and that is the demonization of Black men and Black women as bad parents, and as rapists, and as dangerous mothers. There are so many other aspects of eugenic thought that have gone into the demonization of African Americans in the medical sphere, but this one is particularly important because it has been a very enduring belief, supported through the eugenic era, supported now, probably now today, more vigorously than ever, because now we have eugenic technology to hide behind. There's a lot of eugenic discussion, a lot of eugenic data, but what's really important is how this data is interpreted, how it is used as a weapon against certain people of color. And people have earlier said, I understand the sentiment. People say I'm not anti-science. I'm certainly not anti-science. I spent my whole life in science. I'm not anti-science, but I am aware that science is a pure discipline. The people who practice it are not, and that is our problem. So at the beginning, the African was always seen as subhuman. During the Roman era, Galen, the great physician in Rome, said that African men were unintelligent and had hypersized genitalia, and it went down from there. The slave trade actually exacerbated this because now we have economic and political impetus for demonizing African Americans as subhuman, and as many other things too, unintelligent, but also, principally, bestial sexuality. Now, during the Victorian era, this was a very dangerous charge. Sexuality was the core of someone's spirit, their morality, their soul. And for women in particular, they were on a pedestal and they were held to be sexually chaste. And white women were sexually chaste and fiercely defensive mothers. They would die defending their children. They were basically martyrs to sexuality. Whereas white men in the Victorian era prided themselves on treating women well by their lights, which meant putting them on a pedestal and then otherwise abusing them, but still viewing them as chaste creatures. That was very important, but not black women. Black women were the exact opposite of white women. Black women were sexually irrepressible Jezebels, always enticing white men into inappropriate sexual relationships. That's how we got all the mulattoes, in case you didn't know. And also, black women were very bad mothers, murderously indifferent mothers. So murderously indifferent that there were entire diagnoses based on their character and their abuse and neglect of their children. For example, there was one disease called overlaying. Only black women were ever diagnosed with overlaying. This was when you had a child who was smothered by the mother in the sleep. She'd roll over him, smother him, not even notice it. This was overlaying. And it was invoked to explain the high death rate, the high infant mortality rate on the plantation, which of course was actually being caused by overwork, abuse, and malnutrition, but was blamed on the mothers. The fathers didn't fare much better. The fathers were basically sperm donors, but they were black women were not only sperm donors, they had children carelessly, they paid no attention to them afterwards. Sound familiar? Not that different from what we hear today, right? But there's more, too. Black women were also, more importantly to the Victorian white males, they were rapists. They were inherent natural rapists. There was a slew of doctors with data and case studies, and to all opine and agree that black men were interested in raping white women. They said that most men in most races would not do a thing like that, but black men had a very strong desire to rape white women. That, coupled with the fact that all black men had syphilis, or another equally bad STD, black women as well, made them actually dangerous, because not only would they rape a white woman any chance they got, they'd also infect her, condemning her to a life of invalidity during that era, when they didn't have any cures for syphilis. Okay, so now we have black male rapists and black women who were basically whores, who cared nothing for their children. And that was the sentiment of the past validated by medicine, and that is the sentiment that we face today. There have been also studies linking black men to violence, not only rape, but all other kinds of violence. And here we've got sort of a little catalog of the worst ones in the past couple of decades. But in Baltimore in 1969, 15,000 African-American boys were tested, given karyotypes, looking for an XYY chromosomal anomaly. This would link to violent behavior. And then they had 500 white boys as a control group. But guess what? Who had the high rates? White boys. So it was quietly abandoned as a possible cause of violence. But then they tried again in 1995, right here in New York City. I'm sorry to say that although the courts exonerated it, I'm careful to say the courts never held Columbia as a defendant. They were initially accused by the victims. There were a lot of other psychiatrists who gave fenfluramine to young boys to evoke a serotonin response that was said to be indicative of having violent tendencies. Now, it also invoked the wrong response, at which point they changed their theory. Oh, we meant to say that if it was less than serotonin. But basically, they were hell-bent on showing that these young boys had a violent tendency. All the boys were black. I called the principal investigator and I asked, why were all the boys black? He said, they weren't all black. I said, I have the protocol here, it says they're all black. He said, where did you get that? I said, never mind. He said, well, they happen to all be black. This happens to be our catchment area, Washington Heights, I said, but some were from Brooklyn. He said, I know nothing about that. I said, you're the PI, how can you not know? And he said, I said, I want to know why all the boys were black. He said, no, some were Dominican. He said, no, some were Hispanic. I said, all the Hispanic boys were black Dominicans, so they were all black. So he said, call me back, I'll have answers for you. I called him back, he said, I've been told not to talk to you. So that was the end of that. But there are draconian lengths gone to torture data, to corrupt data in order to show, to validate these theories. And what I'm going to talk about is especially insidious because it's under the radar. We talk about, and I know I've been really happy to see men exonerated by DNA. We see it all the time. A man comes on TV, he's been in jail 20 years, average is actually 12 years. And now they find he's innocent. I don't know why they had to wait 20 years, but now they find he's innocent. And they found he's innocent by this testing. They use testing of looking for genetic alleles, and if there's no match to the biological material left behind by the assailant, they determined that this could not have been the man who's responsible. Now, what's actually going on is that this sounds like a really good thing. It is a really good thing for those 200, 300 men who've been exonerated. But the real import is the window into the criminal justice system. Let's see how many men are being wrongfully convicted. And who are these men? They're African-American men. Some of them are white, but 70% have been African-American men during the last decade or so. And one lawyer associate said to me, the exonerated inmates are mostly African-American men convicted of raping white women. He went on to say only 10% of reported sex attacks are allegations of white women attacked by black men. Yet 54% of all unjust convictions involve African-American men wrongfully convicted of assault of white women. This is a crime that seems connected with many, many wrong convictions. And it was fated to be so, because doctors had decided from the advent of African-Americans on these shores that black men were rapists. And still, the data continues to fill that out. Now it's bolstered by technology. The other thing about the technology being used to exonerate the men, the same technology is being used to fill databases, criminal databases, with the DNA of black and Hispanic men. And here's how it works. It's a form of cold hit technology, basically where you have a crime, biological material left behind by the defendant, but you don't know who he is. So what do? You take this biological material and you test it against your database. If you find him in the database, bingo. If you don't find him in the database, now you have to do what's called a DNA sweeps. DNA sweeps are nakedly racial very frequently. That is, police officers are not only looking for a criminal, they're looking for a black criminal. And how do they get the DNA to test? They round up all the black people in the community, all the black men in the community, and they convince them to surrender their DNA. They're sometimes convinced in their workplaces where the police turn up at your job, say that you're a crime and a murder or a rape, but you can exonerate yourself easily by giving us a sample. If you don't want to give us a sample, we'll go downtown and take it further. So is that voluntary? Not in my book. And what's really interesting about that is of all the people in all the sweeps have been coerced to give their DNA, how many hits do you think in 7,000 different tests, how many hits do you think they found? 1. That's not surprising. The guilty man is not going to surrender his DNA. It's innocent men who are cajoled, embarrassed, pressured, and out of fear surrender their DNA. Where does that DNA go once they have it? It goes into the database. So now we have the national database, CODIS, and various state and local databases filled with the DNA of innocent black and Hispanic men just waiting to be convicted the next time there's a crime, and they can find any sort of match. Because it used to be that they would adhere to a certain type of match. We're talking about something called single nucleotide polymorphisms. So you put them on like a computer chip, and it used to be you had to match 15 different points. Then it went down to 13. It keeps getting lower and lower to the point where men have been convicted, and later on it's been found out it was not them, but their cousin. Not them, but their brother. Not them, but a great uncle. So it's not very precise, and yet people are being convicted. And again, these databases hold the DNA of innocent black and Hispanic men. And our former police commissioner, Howard Safer, remember him? Know what he does for a living now? He's CEO of 2 of these companies. What he wants to do, and so far he's been pretty successful, he wants to give every police officer on the street a laptop with the information from these databases. So when they stop black and Hispanic men in their cars or on the street, they can coerce them or persuade them to give a sample, run it in the car, and if there's a match, arrest them immediately. But who's in that sample? Who are they arresting? Who's in the database now? You might remember 3 or 4 years ago, the law was changed so that not people who were convicted, but anybody who had been stopped by police, not even arrested, stopped by police. So if the police stop me because they don't like my looks or something, imagine that. If they stop me and get my DNA, they can get my DNA, and now I'm a potential suspect waiting to be identified. The same technology that's exonerating innocent black men is now going to convict many, many more innocent black and Hispanic men who are ever exonerated. So I want to say one word before I stop about indifferent fathers, and then I'll be quiet. This mythology about African American fathers is very pervasive, and it infects the medical system as well. But the data tell us something different. It's true that in the US, 1 out of 3 men don't live with their children, 1 out of 3. So if you hear that 1 out of 3 black men don't live with their children, that sounds terrible until you find out that's also true of all American men. Moreover, studies have shown that African American men tend to be more involved with their children on a daily basis, not less. So this absent father from the Victorian era that everyone has been decrying for decades and decades, the sperm donor, who is he really? He's this guy. I think that cartoon speaks for itself. And one last word, and that has to do with our neo-eugenic policies toward contraception in black women. The heyday at first seemed to have been the 80s, when black women were 90% of the people who were told, you've committed a crime, or at least we think you have, you can go to jail, or you can be implanted with Norplant, a physician-controlled contraceptive, so you'll have no more children. Now, what's the rationale? The rationale is, well, she's shown she's a bad mother, again. She's shown she's a bad mother by committing a crime. This way, there'll be no future children for her to be a bad mother to abuse, no future children for the state to support. But that doesn't protect children. In fact, keeping a child from being born is a pretty draconian way of protecting him, don't you think? The real rationale, of course, is punishment. You're punishing this woman. But you're only punishing black women, 90%, remember? And the mentality is expressed by posters like this that show the depth of disdain for black women and the belief that they are inherently bad mothers. As is one last image I wanted to show you. This one. I don't know if you've seen this clever little billboard. Yes. But this sums up the sentiment. And we have to remember, this is not just sentiment of, ignorant or racist people. This is something that is held by too much of the medical community. So again, medicine is good, science is good, in theory. In practice, it depends on the person practicing it. And so far in the US, we have a lot of work to do. Thank you for listening to me.
So before we begin the Q&A, I would like to first ask the panel a question that came to me while I was listening to these phenomenal presentations. So we're currently living in an age where advancements in science are developing at breakneck speeds, which is giving way to technologies that are meant to make us fitter, better, more happier selves, both as individuals and as a society as a whole. Behind this progress is the ideology that this is inherently good for us. Behind it, too, is the belief that these technologies can and will liberate us all. But as we've seen in today's presentations, that's not the case. Historically, and even today, there are several examples of this. Communities of color, in particular, have carried the brunt of the violence that has been made possible by the union of technology and societal actors who would rather eradicate than uplift them. And the memories of this violent past have yet to fade. In my own interviews with young queer black men about the contemporary HIV/AIDS epidemic, many refer back to the Tuskegee syphilis experiment when describing to me their mistrust of modern Western medicine. Many don't want to take Truvada, a pill that if taken daily can prevent HIV/AIDS, because they fear that they may be being poisoned rather than protected. So given all of this, in the words of Ms. Solange Knowles, I'd like to ask, where do we go from here? Is it possible for us to harness these technologies in ways that are equitable for us all, especially for underserved communities? And if so, what might that look like?
Okay, I'll dive in. The technologies are not what's in question here. What's in question is the way that we devise, regulate, and approve medications? Who is involved and who is not involved? You know, this invocation of the Tuskegee experiment is something that I find just a slight bit wearying, because very frequently it's invoked without any real evidence that that is what's motivating people. In fact, Thomas Leviest at Johns Hopkins did surveys in which he found that Black people who had never heard of Tuskegee were more suspicious of medical research. So it's not just Tuskegee, it's a long history. And actually, it's also a present in which, by and large, African Americans are excluded from decision-making about new technologies and new drugs, are asked to accept it on faith and on trust. I mean, the first thing you said is something that we all say. It's meant to do this, it's meant to do that. And we all know what you mean by that. But think about that. Do we really know what it's meant to do? And frankly, is that important? It's not really important, you know, because it's a rationale that makes sense. But the real question is, what will it do? And when we think about what it will do, we have to look at unforeseen consequences that should be foreseen consequences. There are certain consequences of genetic technology and other technologies that are clearly foreseeable, but we either don't discuss them, we wait until they basically bite us in the butt afterwards, and it's too late. You know, the problems already crop up. But frankly, these are all things that could have been foreseen. So the bottom line, go on and on and on, the bottom line is that our drug approval system needs to involve more people who are going to actually take those drugs. Right now, it's all scientists. The law only requires one non-scientist on a panel. And what good will that one non-scientist? They're sitting there looking at all these scientists. How are they going to argue with them? They have no power. You know, I said in medical apartheid 10 years ago, we need an IRB system where half people in the community who will be taking the drugs and half scientists jointly approve a drug. And then people will be able to trust it better.
Thank you.
Okay. Just to riff off that, I do want to bring into the room Dorothy Roberts and all of her amazing work, starting with Killing the Black Bodies. And if you haven't read it, please go get it right now, today. And also Dr. Ruha Benjamin, who wrote The People's Science. And I feel like less people have read that, but she pushes out into the forefront our role in bioethics committees, which are all over the country. I'm not sure how it's set up in other countries, but in the US, you too can join your bioethics committee that make very large decisions around how testing and experimentation happens. And they're often being led by literally cis, white, straight men from corporations that are deciding bioethics policies in state and city legislation. And so Dr. Ruha Benjamin pushes the question, where are we on the bioethicists committees? I love that question. Also, I'm actually involved with organizing across the country with different bioethicists, research scientists, organizers, healers, and health practitioners that have come to me at different times based on different work I've done as a Black queer feminist organizer. And I'm actually seeing, like a decade later, I implicitly and explicitly challenged some research scientists on their role of perpetrating white supremacy. And they're doing a transformative conference this year on how to do research ethically and responsibly. And it took several scientists and their colleagues to make that happen. I've been asked to present at MIT or Harvard with bioethicists on how are we challenging the ways they're learning about bioethics and holding a real, to the flame, a political analysis that brings in a white supremacist lens, a disability justice lens, I should say anti-white supremacist lens, disability justice lens, trans justice lens, so on and so forth, that really pulls open the paradigm of how they're being told about medicine. And then with health practitioners, the medical industrial complex timeline that was, again, co-curated by many organizers that were building together is actually what we see as a tool to use with scientists, healers, and health practitioners to talk about what is the history of scientific racism, what is the history of eugenics, and the MIC, not just in this country, but in the world. I mean, Tuskegee experiment happened here, and then what? It moved to Guatemala, led by the Guatemalan government. So it's like, do people know that? Surprise. So like this is deep, it continues onward. So how are we building our own analysis, shared strategies to transform not just history, but future? And I'm sitting down with doctors and public health lawyers and healers too of energy body-based work that want to push each other on how do we create integrative models of care that centralize community and the ways we want to be well together.
Such a more comprehensive answer than what I've really been thinking about. Sorry. I was thinking about putting abolitionism, is that better? Abolitionism at the, just Dr. Ruth Wilson Gilmore's question to us, how are we constantly thinking about abolitionism at the forefront of our movements? And I really think it has to be at the forefront of scientific education. I think that kind of the way in which you articulated it so much more discreetly as a strategy, that's how I would think about putting together abolitionist efforts and scientific education, because to me it seems that there's a real moment for transformative potential there. I just have to say that the errors in CODIS are so unbelievable. It is a failure of the ways in which often journalists take up basically PR kind of white papers for companies as if they're scientific fact. I find in the promotion of those databases just makes me want to scream, because really, it's unbelievable it's allowed to stand. It's unbelievable the fingerprint has been allowed to stand. That comes right out of eugenics, and 100 years of trying to make the fingerprint work has not made it a reliable identification technology, and I'm not surprised that these new codifications also don't work. Bah! Yes.
I want to thank Harriet for leading the way in making the possibility or reality of getting the J. Marion Sims statue removed from East Harlem. Now, the problem is it's not gone yet, and the city's not talking to us and letting us know when that's going to happen. And so I'd like to encourage everyone on Monday morning to call 212 New York and tell the mayor we want the statue gone. And then second, if anyone can speak to the issue of the new microchips that people, corporations are having employees put in.
I'd like to speak to that. Yes, of course. I definitely want to speak to that. It's something that my training as an ethicist has been really interesting. And one of the more interesting things that has happened is that since 1980, we've had an escalation in the commodification of medicine. It's become more and more a corporate enterprise focused on developing patents and realizing profits. That's changed everything, the way we practice medicine, the way we do research, everything. One of the things that has happened in the advent of that is that when I went to the Harvard School of Public Health, my first week, I got the shock of my life. I was surrounded by all these brilliant people. I have an MD, PhD, I'm a lawyer, and now I want to go to the tropics. And they asked me what I'm doing. I was like, I'm just a writer, But the professors wanted to talk to me. You know why? They all had biotech companies. And they all were trying to make money from their research. So now we have ethicists sitting on the boards of companies like Pfizer, drug makers. These ethicists are actually giving their imprimatur, you could also call it a rubber stamp, to things that they want to do. So you can't call us unethical. We've got so-and-so of, University X, on our board. Anyway, one of the things that's happening is that when I spend a lot of my time speaking at ethics departments at universities around the country and Western Europe, and one of the things that's happening is that people want to change the way medicine is practiced, but they insufficiently appreciate the extent to which it's now codified in laws and regulations. And frankly, medical people, or pretty much like any other people, they're going to do what they can do very often. 2 out of 5 experiments are now conducted in the developing world. When those doctors go to the developing world, they are asked, are you doing everything by the book you're doing? Are you doing things by the regulations? And what are they going to say? They say yes. Are they really? Maybe. So the bottom line is we have to keep in mind that there are these a matrix of laws telling people what they can and can't do. And all the protesting in the world and all the attempts to make them see the light are not going to change behavior as much as changing those laws will. I've become convinced of that. And so I think we need to, first of all, know what these laws are, and then try to do something about them together. Like we brought the statue down collectively, we can change the laws collectively. We first have to know what they are. We have to know. Do you know there's a law in this country saying that you can be used for medical research without your permission? It's been legal since 1996. So anyway, I'll stop here, but you get my point. We really have to look at the existing infrastructure of laws and attack that if we want to see meaningful change.
And for those of us that don't have a lot of access to this technological knowledge, can you just run it by what these bad companies might be doing with our DNA that we can't think of?
I mean, if growing the prison industrial complex, I think by increase, like the notion that I think you could have like a partial match with the DNA with CODIS, that you'd stop people and then collect their DNA and then run a match by them that will probably yield like a false positive, or that has like a 1 in 50 chance of yielding a false positive, such that that person's life will be interrupted, or such that they'll be more easily criminalized. To me, it's pretty much like the most horrific future. That's like the growth of the neo form of slavery. I would say, with radio tags, it's like all of these technologies just so much have their roots in white supremacy. Like radio tags, those chips that Walmart's been using, they were first used on HIV-positive prisoners of Guantanamo Bay when it was, mostly occupied by Haitian refugees. So I just feel like the histories of them so much determine the ways in which they really work to grow the prison industrial complex, and it really puts to my mind the importance of abolitionist efforts.
I think your question, a good example of what can happen if you look at the Havasupai Nation. This is an Indian group that lives in the Grand Canyon. And they were concerned about their high diabetes rate. They approached the University of Arizona, I believe, and asked them, please do a genetic analysis, try to find out why we have so much diabetes, and help us. And the university said they would do that, yes. They came in, spent a lot of time, took a lot of blood, interviewed a lot of people, emerged with a lot of data, and then they published studies showing that this group had high schizophrenia rates. They published a study showing that a lot of people in this group were not genetically related to each other, so how could they all claim to be Havasupai? They published nothing on diabetes. I think what's important to remember here is that you talk about companies and bad companies. I'm not willing to call them all bad. I'm sure maybe 10 or 11% are good. But the bottom line is there are good ones, but the bottom line is that you can't, I do not make a dividing line between companies and medical researchers anymore. So much medical research is funded directly by corporations that there are cases where you could call some departments of some universities, I will name them actually. Some of these departments, you could call them a department of the pharmaceutical company. For example, when I was at Harvard, Shiseido gave the Department of Dermatology some huge amount of money and said, in exchange for this, we want to have all your research, we want to have all the patents, we want to be able to exploit everything that you come up with.
Wow.
So you could argue that, okay, did Shiseido just become, Harvard's department become part of Shiseido? You could also ask, are they, as Marsha Angel did, she said, are they now going to be looking to skincare and cosmetics rather than skin cancer? So you can't really differentiate between many medical departments and researchers and the corporations who are funding their research, quite heavily sometimes. And this is a good example of what happens when they get the data they want, get the samples they want, and then pursue their own agendas without any. See, the input from the people, again, it's got to have teeth. Maybe those researchers said to the people, yes, we will pursue I'm sure they did, we'll pursue your diabetes. But when it came to court, these people did not have a leg to stand on. They didn't have any legal power. And that's my point. We have to do something with the law and make sure that people cannot be exploited in this manner anymore.
So we unfortunately have to end the panel now, but I'd like to thank the panelists for their fantastic presentations and for all of you attending and your questions as well.